Morning everyone, hope you're well and welcome to this session. We're doing another Facebook Live here at Enterprise in Barnsley. Today we're joined by Kat Derbyshire from Black Cat HR and today we're going to be talking about the process businesses need to go through if they're in the unfortunate stage of having to make people redundant. So this is the first of two sessions we're doing regarding redundancy. So this one is from the viewpoint of businesses and what businesses need to do, and how to go through the process to make sure it's fair and equal for everyone involved. And then we're doing another session next week, which is all about what happens if you are being made redundant, what support is available to you as an employee, and where you can get help in terms of CV writing and other things. And that's next week. Both of the videos are also going to be on the Enterprise in Barnsley YouTube channel, and they are both also going to be on the Enterprise in Barnsley website on the appropriate pages. If you go to enterpriseinbarnsley.co.uk, you can see it on there and get full support as well. Also, everything we talk about today will be detailed in text with links and everything else you need on the individual pages on that website. We'll also put some links in the comments as we go along as appropriate. Okay, if you are watching through Facebook, please feel free to leave comments and I will ask them as we go on the video if you're watching it live. If you're not watching it live, again, feel free to leave comments and we'll come back to you as soon as we can do. Okay, then, Kat. So obviously it's never nice when a company has to make people redundant. Unfortunately, in the current situation we're in, it's going to happen to more and more companies, unfortunately. So I suppose probably the first question, well, before we start the redundancies, probably the first thing we need to look at is we're now at the beginning of July and there's been quite a lot of changes to the furlough scheme that's been run by the government support through COVID-19. Now, obviously, those changes are going to impact and probably drive more redundancies. Do you want to just start by talking us through what the changes to that furlough scheme are at the moment?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, like you say, this is probably a good place to start because this is probably going to be a catalyst for a lot of change that does come about. So first and foremost, as people probably already know, the scheme has been extended up to the 31st of October, but it's already started now to go through that transition phase of starting to ask employers to contribute a little more, but also adding some flexibilities in. So as of this month, as of July, employers can bring people back on a flexible furlough arrangement, so they can come back for some of their hours and furloughed for the rest, whereas previously furlough's been no hours worked. So at the minute, we're looking at no further people being able to add to the furlough scheme. However, the flexibility is now there for employers to bring people back part-time. As we move into August, employers will need to cover the cost of national insurance and pension contributions. And then as we get to September, employers will need to contribute 10% of that 80% furlough payment. It'll increase to 20% contribution from October, and then the scheme is planned to end at the end of October. So that's kind of what the transition is going to look like on that front.
Okay, so there is quite a few things there. So a bit more flexibility in terms of if you want to manage your workforce back into the workplace on a part-time basis. So it's not all or nothing, but obviously there's more contributions coming in. And again, just to make you all aware that this information is correct as of the 3rd of July 2020, which is when this video was recorded. Obviously, any announcements after that are different as well. So if you are watching this much after the video, do just double check on the gov.uk website about what support is available, because again, the furlough scheme may change and there is further announcements from the Chancellor coming next week, which again might mean there's different changes, it might not. So again, just with everything we do, just make sure you're checking up on everything we say later down the line if you're watching it at a later date. So unfortunately this time we are seeing companies having to make redundancies. So if you're a company owner or a manager or a director and you're looking at thinking that you're in that position of, well, we've got to let some people go, unfortunately. Before companies do that, what options should be exploring before to going down the route to try and reduce job losses where possible?
Yeah, because I think sometimes it is one of those situations where people naturally think, I need to make changes, I need to make redundancies. And it may be that is what you need to do. But there are other things that you can consider first. So we've just talked about the furlough scheme. It might be that employers can continue to use that in the time that it's available, but also looking at things like reducing hours that people work. So looking at reducing people's weekly hours, looking at potentially making changes to salary levels, all in consultation. If businesses have been recruiting, they might need to look at either deferring or withdrawing job offers. It might be that there's still some use of overtime or contractors, and is it that could be reduced or removed to negate the need for a redundancy situation. So it's just looking first at the landscape as a whole and deciding, are there other things we can do without needing to go down a redundancy route, either now or basically being able to ride out a bit longer if it's, for example, using the furlough scheme whilst there's still support in place. So it's just taking a holistic view across the piece really and see what situation you've got.
Okay, so with the potential, for example, reduction of hours or pay, again,
Yes.
do they have to go through some form of consultation to do that, or is it just an agreement with the employees, or how does that work? If somebody kind of goes, well, actually, what we can do, we want to keep you all on, but we need to cut a 20% of our wage bill at the moment, so therefore, would you all work for 80% of your salary rather than 100% for the time being, and then we put it back up when we can? Is that doable? And what legal processes are for that side of things?
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously these things can be done, but it would need to be in consultation with employees, because ultimately it'd be a change to their contract of employment, their terms and conditions of employment.
Mm-hmm.
So if it was going to be, you could do it potentially on a temporary basis, like you alluded to there, or it could be something that you're looking at making a permanent change to someone's hours. But it would all need to go through a consultation process where people potentially may agree to do it. They may not, in which case you potentially would still find yourself in a situation where you may still lose people. But I guess it gives people other alternatives as opposed to straight down a redundancy route, if that's an option as a business.
Okay, interesting. So again, it's about that flexibility and talking with your staff at that point and trying to come up with a solution.
Yeah.
So if they've tried all that, they've got rid of the contractors, they've cut back on the overtime, they've tried everything they can do, and it has come down to the line of, right, the only option now left on the table is unfortunately making people redundant.
Yes.
Obviously at the moment with the furlough scheme, where do companies sit with furlough workers? Are they treated differently to other workers because they're being furloughed compared to somebody who's still in work? What is there any differentiation between the two at the moment?
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say that when it comes to furloughed workers, they're in the same position as everybody else. They're still part of your team. They may not currently be at work, but they still work for your business in the same way as people who are still working. So they would be treated in exactly the same way. They should be treated no less favourably, if you want to use that term, because of the fact that they are furloughed at the moment.
Okay. So again, they're all part of the team. They're all in the same thing. So it's not a case of, well, we furloughed them, they're the ones that have to be made redundant first. It's a case of they're all in the same pot, and it's an equal approach to everyone. Okay.
Yes, definitely the case. Yes.
Okay. So what are the reasons that a company can make an employee redundant? Are there some set criteria out there? How can they work that through?
Yeah, so it's fair to say from a fair redundancy process, there are specific reasons that a company can make redundancies. So it might be that businesses have stopped trading entirely, which we know could be the case, particularly at the moment around COVID. Businesses that are going to no longer operate in that location. So they may be, for example, closing one particular depot or one particular location, but remaining open in others. Or ultimately, it might be a case that there is less of a need for a certain skill set. So there could be reasons why you'll be going through a redundancy process. But it's really important that whichever one of those reasons it is that you are going down the redundancy route, that's made really clear throughout the process when you're dealing with employees, to let them know which one of those reasons is the reason why you're in a potential redundancy situation.
Okay, so if you are, for example, one example you mentioned there was if you're wanting to close one location compared to others.
Yes.
Obviously, if you've kind of got national branches, is it a case of you just do the redundancies on that particular site, or do you have to do a redundancy across the entire company where we're offering potential redeployment of staff or things like that? How would that work?
Yeah, so you would be focusing on, if you're closing a location, then you would be consulting with the people at that location. So depending on what the situation is, if you've got positions that potentially those people could be moved into at other locations, that would be one of the options that you'd discuss with those people. Obviously, you're not obliged to create roles in other locations, but if you have got vacancies there, then you would make people aware that those are available, and then it would be down to that employee as to whether they want to relocate and all that kind of stuff to consider. as an alternative to them needing to be made redundant. Of course, if it's something a long way away, people may not want to uproot their families and whatever else and move to a different part of the country, for example. But it's an option that should be put on the table for people if there are other vacancies in those other locations.
Okay, excellent. So I'm sure anyone watching this as an employer wants to make the redundancy process as fair as possible to all members of staff.
Sure.
And I know we're going to talk about the best practice for doing that shortly. But what are the consequences to a company if the redundancy process isn't done in a fair and transparent manner?
Yeah, so I guess ultimately the risk with a redundancy process is that employees could claim that the process isn't fair. That's the main risk. So ultimately, I guess particularly at the moment, one of the things to consider around that is the fact that whilst there is a furlough scheme in place, whether in the event that someone feel that they've been unfairly made redundant, was it reasonable that they were made redundant as opposed to using the furlough scheme, for example? So these are the things that I guess employers need to be aware of in terms of considering all their options and making sure that the redundancy is the right option and the fair route to take, and at this point in time.
Okay, so what would count as an unfair redundancy process then? What would be the flags for that?
Yeah, so I guess ultimately looking at, for example, could the furlough scheme have been utilised? That could be a reason why it was claimed to be unfair. But thinking about going through the consultation process, it's looking at whether employers have fairly identified who should be at risk. So from a selection pool perspective, have they fairly chosen who should be in there and therefore who's been placed at risk? Have they consulted correctly? So depending on, kind of numbers involved in that consultation process, have they met the required timescales? Have they done it in the right way? Have they had a fair way of actually selecting people to be made redundant? Whether that's putting them into some kind of scoring matrix, using some fair, transparent criteria, or whether that's people reapplying for remaining roles. And also making sure that employees are made aware of any other suitable alternative roles that are available in the business for them to consider whether they are potential alternatives to them being made redundant. So they are the potential watch outs really of how it could become an unfair process if these things aren't accounted for correctly.
Okay. So looking at creating a good, fair and process then, what steps should be undertaken to make it fair and open for everyone?
Yeah, so I think first and foremost, if businesses have got a redundancy process in place, a policy, then they need to make sure that they're following that. But looking at it across the board, then I think it's about having a clear plan of how to identify who has been selected as being at risk of redundancy. Being clear about how long the consultation process will last to take them through that process. What meetings will be held, so what consultations can they expect to attend, how will that be held? I guess at the moment, because of some of the challenges around face-to-face meetings, it's thinking about how you're going to do that. Will that be on a Zoom call? Will people come into an office? What will they do to actually hold those meetings? And just making sure that throughout this process, when it comes to a conclusion, that employees are given the right of appeal, because that is their statutory right, if they do feel that in some way that it's not been done correctly or fairly.
Okay. And then during the consultation period, is there anything that employers have to let employees know? Or
So
go on.
Yeah, so I guess first and foremost, we talked about sort of reasons why redundancies could come about, making employees aware of which reason it is that this process is happening, how many people are at risk, so the number of people, the job types that are actually in that consultation process, how they'll be selected to appoint people into any remaining roles, and basically how the redundancy process is going to run so that people are informed. So I guess they are the key things to be covered in that.
Okay, I'm just getting a bit of feedback from your microphone there, Makai. I don't even want to move your microphone forward at all slightly, but yeah, okay, sorry about that.
Better.
Yeah, that's better, thank you. So yeah, obviously there's quite a lot of detail to go through there, and that the company's got to consider and make sure that their employees have got all the information they need. what sorts of financial consideration should a company plan for when looking at making people redundant?
Yeah, so I guess first and foremost, they're going to need to be looking at people's length of service. So for anyone who's got less than 2 years service, complete years of service, that is, with the business, won't have any entitlement to a statutory redundancy payment. For anyone who has got 2 years plus, then they will have at least a statutory entitlement, potentially even an enhanced entitlement, depending on what happens internally in that particular business. So they will be, if we're looking purely at statutory, they would have an entitlement based on their age at the point where they're made redundant, their length of service at that time, and their salary level. So businesses would need to sort of factor in the cost of that into that process.
And is there anything in terms of the payment, and how does that payment impact on both tax for the company and the individual?
Yeah, so in terms of redundancy payments themselves, anything up to 30,000 would be tax free. So when it comes to someone receiving a final package, if you like, at redundancy, their redundancy payment up to the 30,000 would be tax free. Any notice or pay in lieu of notice holidays that they may be paid that they've not taken, those would be subject to the normal deductions. So that's kind of the basis of that. And it's about being clear when communicating that package to employees, that they understand which elements of it are taxable and which elements of it would be tax-free. And that would be the gist of what that would look like.
Right, okay. So at what point legally is a consultation process required from a company with the employees then?
Yeah, so for anybody who has less than 2 years service, you are able to take a much more informal, less structured approach to doing this process if you want to do that. But as soon as you're looking at people with more than 2 years service, a much more rigid approach is needed. But thinking more around the numbers side, the number of people who are impacted. If you're looking at getting to a place where you've got 20 people up to 100 people impacted within a 90-day period who are at risk of redundancy, they would need a collective consultation. So they would need to go through a process that lasts at least 30 days. If you're looking at larger scale than that, if you're looking at 100 plus, then again, they would need a structured consultation that would be a minimum of 45 days. It was 90 days, but it has been reduced to 45. So for anyone who's maybe managed a process like this with those sort of numbers, it has changed down to 45 days more recently. And for these sorts of numbers, there would need to be a HR1 form submitted to notify of the level of impact here. And I guess the really important from an employer's point of view is that in the event that they don't meet these consultation timescales, then it could end up in a situation where, firstly, it gives people grounds for potentially putting in claims for not meeting that timescale of consultation, but also businesses could potentially be prosecuted if they're not submitting these HR1s. So quite important from an employer's point of view to get this right.
Okay, and where do the companies get the HR1 form from?
So you can get that online, you can get it off the government website, and it is just literally a notification really of what's changing to submit that. But yeah, it's one of those things that needs to be done at the very beginning. Once you know your numbers of people impacted are in these categories, then the HR1 form needs to be done up front.
Okay. So the companies now, they've identified the need to make a number of redundancies. They've got their process in place. They're aware they've got to the consultation. They know the legal outlines they need to do. It's now getting to the point where they're having to actually hold the face-to-face meetings or the meetings with the members of staff. Yeah. So how should a consultation meeting be held? What's the best practice that a company can be doing at that point?
Yeah, so on a normal day, I mean, outside of the COVID situation, you would normally be having face-to-face meetings with employees, but appreciating at the moment might not be practical. I guess it's looking at how you can hold those meaningful conversations in the right way. So whether that's in a controlled environment face-to-face, whether that's via a Zoom meeting or Teams or whatever technology you use, how that will look, but making sure that those consultations happen, because there is still the same legal expectation that these consultations happen as they would in any other time. There is no legal requirement for it to be face-to-face, but they need to happen. But also it's about factoring in the fact that because these are formal meetings, if employees want to bring along a representative, so workplace colleague or a trade union representative, that they are still able to do that, and the arrangements are made so that when these meetings happen, that can be facilitated, because that still needs to be available to everyone during this process.
Okay. And then I suppose one of the final points we've got a question on the Facebook chat as well, so I'll ask that towards the end as well. So how can the business want to make sure they're supporting the staff going through this, be a good employer? What's the best practice in terms of supporting their employees that have obviously been working with them for a while? How can a company be a good employer and support the staff as much as possible?
And I guess the thing is, it's looking at what ways you can practically help those people to find other work. So it might be that you are putting them in touch with organisations that can help them with CV writing, for example, to go out and find other alternative employment. It could be putting them in touch with services that can help them find alternative work, be that recruitment agencies, be that, sort of the job centre, or whatever that might look like. And also, if people are working through a notice period, allowing them that time to be able to go and actively seek other work, attend interviews where it's appropriate to do so, and just basically trying to make that process as accessible for employees to be able to secure other work during the time that they are actually working a notice period. So yeah, it's just all those extra things that you can do. And potentially, if you're on larger scale redundancies, you might be looking to bring people in that can offer this kind of support and do it, if you're employees specifically in your business, as opposed to making recommendations to go outside and do that outside of the business.
Okay, excellent. So the question we've had on Facebook is, if you started as an apprentice and then went on to work for the company for the next 6 years, would you get redundancy payment for the year you were an apprentice for? So how does apprenticeships tie in then going on to work, covering redundancies in terms of working time?
Yeah, so in terms of continuous service, if you had worked for a business on an apprenticeship agreement that then continued straight into further work, then I would suggest that you would be counting that continuous service as the full period, because ultimately they have continuously worked for your company for that period of time. So I would count that apprenticeship service as well as the other service all as one period.
Right, okay, so as long as there's not been a break in that employment,
yes,
if they've done apprenticeship and then from the apprenticeship turned into a full-time member of staff and continued to work again without a break, you take the apprenticeship into account, would you?
Yes, yeah.
So
Luke, I hope, whole lot.
Okay, so Luke, I hope that's answered your question. So Joe, I hope that's answered your question, sorry. Okay, so thank you very much for that, Kat. Really appreciate your time on that one.
You're welcome.
Everything we've talked about today can be found on the ACAS website, which is ACAS, that's acas.org.uk/manage-staff-redundancies. And we'll put that in the comments of all the different Facebook Live videos. And as I say, if you're watching this on Enterprising Barnsley website at a later date, if you look below the video, you'll find all the information you need as well, and there'll be a link to that website. As I say, we are doing another Facebook Live on Tuesday, so a few days time, and that's going to be focusing on if you as a member of staff are being made redundant, what support's available to yourself, how you can access things like CV writing that Kat talked about just now, but also what other support mechanisms are in place to help you find future employment and move your career forwards. So with that, thank you very much for today once again, Kat, and we will see you all again very shortly for another video. Take care.
Bye-bye.